What happens when panic gets to an investigation before the evidence does? Because in the 80s, the early 90s, the Satanic Panic, police, therapists, communities became convinced that cults were operating and behind murders, kidnappings, abuse, and that started to shape how investigations were carried out. So the real question is, how were investigations warped, distracted, derailed by this fear of the Satanic Panic?
Murder, cults, kidnapping.
Where the trail goes cold, we keep digging.
This is Dead Ends.
Satanic Panic is usually talked about in two extremes. Either people dismiss it as hysteria, or they treat it like it's proof that organized cult networks were operating behind all these different cases, these different murders, these kidnappings, and that it's all a big hidden conspiracy. But the real useful question, I think, especially for this video, is how did this thinking shape real investigations? What did this Satanic Panic and fear do to shape real investigations into real cases? Because this actually is not just about tabloid nonsense. It's not just something that's being spun by a few media outlets. This was a real period between the 80s and the early 90s where these allegations of ritual cults, of ritual abuse entered real policing, entered therapy, entered the social space, entered communities and courtrooms in a big way. They actually started having, I guess, a dangerous shift in thinking where people started exploring it as legitimate causes for these cases before even evidence was available, sometimes treating it as a main theory before actually they've looked at what surrounds that, what's around the edges of this case, what actually is the truth and the evidence saying. So we'll break this video into three sections. First, we'll look at how fear led investigations and different communities to chase that narrative before it was even corroborated. We'll look at how suggestive interviewing and suggestive therapy and questioning techniques were used to change people's memories, change people's narratives of what they know happened. And then thirdly, how it became this wider cultural phenomenon where eventually everything starts getting looked at through that lens of Satanic Panic. So firstly, fear and corroboration. And I think that is the core of it. That's the core of this issue, this problem with how this has entered investigations. And it's that people often started with the conclusion not of what happened here, what does the evidence show? They're starting to start an investigation with, could this be a cult? Is this satanic ritualistic related? And once that happens, you start interpreting everything through that lens. You look at every bit of off evidence, everything that's a little bit out of place, every strange symbol, every coincidence that starts looking at proof of ceremony, proof of ritualistic practices, when actually it could just be coincidental. And you start building this narrative, and it starts to go from rumour to actually a serious thread that you are taking everything through that lens. And eventually, lack of evidence, lack of proof just becomes explained away as actually this is just a really secretive organisation who are really adept and really good at hiding what they do. And I think that's pretty deadly for an investigation, because at that point, you're not testing a theory, you're not following evidence to where that leads, you're just feeding your narrative. And that angle starts to become a massive red herring, but one that is followed. And because it's such a big, exciting angle, and it gives order to events and crimes that might look chaotic or disturbing, it gives a sense of order and understanding. It gives people a reason to say, actually, this is why this is so shocking, because it's these people doing these things. And it gives you that nice story. But often it can't be verified. And that means independent evidence, corroborating stories, actually proving links between people places, acts between these cults, between different organizations, different ritualistic practices, not just atmosphere, not just rumor, not just the sense that this feels wrong or evil, but actually corroborative stories and real evidence. Because I think the real truth is that actually not every disturbing case has some hidden, organized, cultish, criminal network behind it. Sometimes it is just more ordinary, just one person with passionate hatred of someone, or has got caught up in their own narrative about themselves. They may be a bit sadistic, opportunistic, and that person acting in isolation has carried out a crime. But because they look so disturbing, we often are painting that with this angle of, could this be a satanic cult? And we see that in cases we've looked at this year. In the severed head case, they brought cults into the investigation. Shane Stewart, Sally McNally, same thing. It was all viewed through this lens of, could this be a cult act? Rather than, is this related to other things, to criminal activity? Is that where it is? And I think the danger is that because the belief is so frightening, it starts to look like evidence, and you start to paint it like evidence. And that leads nicely on to point two. I think the second biggest issue is in some of these cases, as that evidence and that narrative starts to look true, people start to use real investigative processes, interviewing, to shape the evidence they're gathering. And the stories, the descriptions, the evidence starts to be shaped by this narrative you painted. And a lot of this Satanic Panic era allegations and proof didn't just come out cleanly through people saying, yes, this is the story. A lot of it came out through repeated interviews, suggestive questioning, therapy, trying to draw out people's memories, and just environments where you're priming people to expect that story and to feed into that story. And I think that matters because, especially if there's children involved in the cases, or if it's a therapist exploring someone's childhood and memories, it's really easy to shift that memory into trying to remember that story. So if the therapist, if the questioner, the interviewer, the investigator comes in with that narrative that this is satanic related, it's so easy to shift someone's memory to remembering facts like that. Any strange thing can be painted in that. And the thing with memory is, every time you remember an event, you're painting that a little more, you're colouring it in a little more, and you're shaping it from the truth to a story, because memory it's not a recording. It's just that it is this picture, this narrative that over time we shift to fit with our expectation of what happens, our emotional ties to that event, and we start to paint it into something that doesn't accurately reflect what happened. And when you've got officials, people in positions of investigative power, therapists especially, feeding you that information and saying, you remember that, don't you? This is how it happened, didn't it? Didn't that happen? Then it's so easy for people to become convinced that actually this was some satanic ritualistic abuses, or this was cult related, and they remember these symbols, they remember all these things, and the process just becomes contaminated, especially when it's repeated and repeated, the same questions. It's hard to remember when you're being asked that. And so a lot of these stories aren't necessarily false or true. They've just been painted in a certain way through the investigation. And that makes it really hard to prove, because actually we've come so far that that is what people remember. And it becomes difficult to tie evidence to that, especially so far from investigations where there is less chance to go back, where evidence has become tampered with or it's degraded over time. It becomes way more difficult and way more blurred. And so the third part of this I want to look at is just that cultural lens, because I think the turning fear into corroboration and lack of evidence, the repeat questioning, the warping of people's memories, that explains how these stories happen. But this cultural lens, this media frenzy, this narrative around it is why it actually spread so far and became just a cultural thing, a cultural phenomenon in the 80s, the early 90s, because the environment it's happening in is one of big social anxiety, big social change. Our traditions and our standards are changing. People are challenging the maybe what they'd see as restrictive traditions that they don't want to adhere to, and they're exploring that in different ways. And that may be linked to this behavior that's described as cultish, that actually might just be exploration of identity, of who you are in a different format than people were expecting or people were used to. And we've got these cultures of horror films, horror media. We've got backing that, we've got all this conservative religious pressure painting anything that happens in that sort of devilish, evil mindset, and just building this broader sense that this is something more than it is. And people, I think, like it. It sounds exciting. And it gives you a villain, it gives you a thing to focus on, it gives you something big to explain a lot of your anxiety, a lot of your problems, a lot of your fear, and you start to paint things. Again, in that way, the collective memory starts to become painted, just like the therapists, the investigators, the interviewers are doing with individuals involved in cases. That collective memory, that collective outlook starts to be painted by people feeding into this. You start to see red herrings, misleading evidence as true, and that narrative just starts to spread. And I think that's still evident. You know, we live in a world where it doesn't matter if a piece of news is true, because if it gets out there on social media, as far as people are concerned, it is true. People will read that. Not everyone. Some people will read that as truth, anything they see. And that means that actually in this era, best known, best story beats true. Best known beats best. And I think that was true here, that this best story, which sounds exciting, which explains a lot of anxiety, beats truth. And regardless of if there is truth to it or not, people start viewing it that way. And again, that happens today. People view news, people view truth and investigations through the lens they're sold, depending on who they're following and what they're following. So when we look at Satanic Panic from an investigative standpoint, I think the biggest takeaway is that the real danger wasn't a belief in satanic cults or this satanic activity that's happening. It was what that belief did to the evidence. It was the fact that you treated fear and circumstance as corroborative evidence, as corroborative stories. You shape testimonies based on your story that you've sold yourself. And then that shapes what people remember, further feeding into the investigation. And as a result, naturally, culture, people, communities start to be excited by that and sell them. We've got a satanic issue here, especially when you've got communities with high conservative religion backing that and painting the fact that actually, yes, these are evil. We need to combat this. It all feeds into this wider viewpoint and then eventually made its way into real investigations, which is where the real danger is, because actually then you've got to be really disciplined about separating fear, story from evidence and true corroboration. Because once you start chasing that story, it's very easy to become wrapped up in that. So what do you think? Do you think that Satanic Panic was just a red herring to investigations, or was there more truth? What do you know? Do you know some stories that are real? What happened in your areas? Is this real, or was this red herring? Are there any cases you've looked at where actually there's been evidence that they have just chased this story when it's not necessarily been evidentially true? And then do you think this moral panic is over? Or do you think we've just got new satanic panics which are fueling our viewpoints? How is society now being shaped by these narratives of fear that we see across social media, across the world. And if you've got this far in the video, please hit subscribe. We talk about these sort of things all the time: murder, kidnapping, cults, all the juicy stuff. And we'd love you to join us for that. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you at the next dead end. Goodbye.